We're caught in a trap. I can't walk out.
Hey everyone, in this video we are going to talk about the origins of the Cold War between 1945 up until 1960. Remember, the Cold War lasted until the early 1990s and symbolically ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Cold War dominated American foreign policy from 1945 to 1991. American domestic politics was also heavily marked by the long struggle with the Soviet Union and its communist allies. The U.S. defense industry became a key component of the American economy. The Cold War was also very evident in American culture and society. It was not just a political thing. So how did the Cold War start? Even before the end of World War II, tension began to develop in the wartime alliance between Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. At the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had promised free elections in Eastern European countries the Soviet Union had liberated from Nazi control. However, in the months after the war, it became obvious that these elections would not take place. These nations were known as satellite nations because while they were technically independent, the Soviet Union basically controlled them. You can see the big three of Churchill, FDR, and Stalin pictured here from left to right. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill warned that the Soviet Union was creating an Iron Curtain between Eastern and Western Europe. The Iron Curtain term was coined in a March 1946 speech given by Churchill in Fulton, Missouri. Churchill forcibly proclaimed the Soviet Union was establishing this Iron Curtain, and the moniker stuck since then. You can see here in the map what the Iron Curtain is. On the left side would be the democratic capitalists, and on the right side would be the communists. Early on in the Cold War, the United States began to follow a policy of containment. The containment policy was devised by American diplomat George Kennan. Kennan believed that the United States needed to implement long-term military, economic, and diplomatic strategies in order to contain the spread of communism. Now, Kennan realized they could not stop communism or end it, but they could at least contain the spread of it. Articulated in 1947, the Truman Doctrine was a policy that stated the United States would support any democratic nation that resisted communism. The U.S. also implemented the Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, or ERP. The Marshall Plan was enacted in 1947, where over $12 billion was given to Western European nations to rebuild after World War II. The plan helped produce economic revival and helped fend off the growth of communism influence in many parts of Europe. Stalin tested Western will by enforcing a blockade of Berlin in 1948. This resulted in the Berlin Airlift, which was an American effort that flew supplies into Western Berlin after the Soviet Union and East German governments blockaded roads to the city. American airplanes flew in supplies for 15 months, causing the Soviet Union to call off the blockade as it was not as effective as they hoped. In 1949, the Soviet Union got the atomic bomb and mainland China turned communist. 1949 was a critical year during the Cold War. The Cold War and communist fear had a major impact at home, too. This time became known as the Second Red Scare. You might remember the first Red Scare for the time period after World War I. Many opponents of Truman blamed him for being soft on communism. President Truman instituted a loyalty review board that examined the loyalty of government employees. They examined between 3 and 4 million federal employees, and over 100 workers were discharged or fired from the government. Some were removed because they were homosexuals who were seen as a security risk, and the fear was that they could be blackmailed because of their vulnerability. Truman also used the Smith Act of 1940 to prosecute some leaders of the American Communist Party. The Smith Act outlawed organizations that advocated the overthrow of the American government by force. The HUAC, or House Un-American Activities Committee, was established in 1947 and began to investigate the entertainment and other industries for communist influences. The HUAC created a blacklist with various private agencies indicating individuals in the entertainment industry who might be communists or might be susceptible to being influenced by communists. Many individuals named in the blacklist were fired from their jobs and could not work in the industry for decades. Famously, the Hollywood 10 were a group of writers and directors with strong communist ties. They refused to answer questions at a HUAC hearing. They were given 1 year in prison for contempt of Congress. McCarthyism was a term used to describe the accusations by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy in the early 1950s that asserted that certain people in the government, academia, the arts were secret communists. Senator McCarthy gained a lot of traction and support with these sentiments. McCarthy even went as far as charging President Truman and former Secretary of State George Marshall of being unconscious agents of communism. McCarthy, in a 1954 TV speech, claimed that the U.S. Army has been harboring many communists. Many felt McCarthy went too far. He was attacking a revered institution in the U.S. Army. This ended up being a public relations disaster for Senator McCarthy. State Department official Alger Hiss was famously accused of being a communist spy, and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed for giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Now on to some international items related to the Cold War. The United Nations is an international organization that was founded at the Yalta Conference in 1945 after the Second World War. It was founded by 51 countries committed to maintaining international peace and security and developing friendly relations among nations and promoting social progress, better living standards, and human rights. Due to the unique international character and the powers vested in its founding charter, the organization is able to take action on a wide range of issues and has grown in its scope over time. Currently, there's 193 members. They have a General Assembly, there's a Security Council, which the United States is a permanent member of. They have an Economic and Social Council and other bodies and committees today. The UN can be thought of as an improvement or follow-up to Wilson's League of Nations. Unlike the League of Nations, the United States, of course, has always been a member of the United Nations. As a matter of fact, the United Nations headquarters is in New York City. During the early part of the Cold War, there were two significant military alliances established. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was a military alliance between the United States and Western European countries that was formed in 1949. The Soviets and their satellite countries responded in 1955 by forming what was known as the Warsaw Pact, which you can see pictured on this map here. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and United States built up their nuclear arsenals to dangerous levels. This quickly became known as the nuclear arms race. President Eisenhower, in his 1961 farewell address, warned of the spreading military-industrial complex in the U.S. economy. The military-industrial complex is a network of individuals and institutions involved in the production of weapons and military technologies. The military-industrial complex in a country typically attempts to marshal political support for continued or increased military spending by the national government. Eisenhower warned that this was a dangerous and inappropriate tactic in military spending. Historians have long debated the causes of the Cold War. In the earlier years of the Cold War, American historians often blamed the Soviet Union for the conflict. In the 1960s, revisionists argued that actions taken by the United States forced the Soviet Union to assume a belligerent posture in the post-World War II years. This is still a hotly debated topic among historians. As mentioned earlier, the Cold War began right after World War II and continued through the 1990s.